Hi, everyone. My name is Charity, and I'm a former consular officer with the US Department of State, here with the folks at UDETI Visa. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5 most common reasons that B1, B2 visa applications are refused. So, I've got a lot of information for you, so let's get started. First of all, it's important to understand that there can be lots of reasons why someone is refused a visa. The things that I'm going to talk about today are probably the most common reasons, but everyone's situation is a little bit different. So keep that in mind as you listen to the things that I'm about to share. It's the job of the US Consular Officer to determine if the applicant standing in front of them qualifies for the visa. In other words, do they meet all of the requirements of the visa? And to do this, the consular officer is going to blend the information that the applicant gives them, as well as the answers to the questions that the officer asks at the interview. And then they will combine that with their own knowledge of living and working in that country. Officers are also often thinking about their own experience with traveling, both within the United States and internationally, and using that experience to consider. All of this information is compared by the officer against US visa law. And something that's really important to understand when it comes to B1, B2 visas is that these are not immigrant visas. They are short-term visitor visas. And because of that, there is a section of the law that requires the applicant to show the consular officer that they intend to follow the rules of the visa, which means when their travel is finished, they will leave the United States and return to their home country or wherever they started from. In other words, all of this information, the officer is trying to determine, does the purpose of travel, the reason that this person wants to go to the United States, make sense for this applicant in this place and at this time? So here are some of the things that can get in the way of that decision and potentially lead to a refusal. One of the most common things that I saw when I was doing visa work were people who would travel to the window, say they were planning to travel to the United States, but they really lacked any knowledge of the plans for what they were going to do or even how they were going to get there. Traveling to the United States usually requires some planning unless you live in a country that's close by the United States geographically. It usually involves plane tickets and plane travel, finding a place to stay, whether that's with family or friends who are in the United States or in a hotel, that sort of thing. Also, the United States is very large. I mean, just physically, it's very large. And so people who hadn't thought through exactly what they were planning to do when they got there or where they were going to stay or how they were even going to travel around, sometimes that can raise questions about why the person truly wants to go to the United States. The next thing that often comes up is, why go to the United States if you've never traveled out of your home country ever? Now, there are lots of legitimate reasons why people travel to the United States for their first international trip ever. I mean, there's lots to do in the US, and whether it's for personal reasons like a vacation or visiting people that you know, or it's for business travel like a conference or some training or to visit maybe a home office of a company, there are lots of really good reasons why people travel to the US as their first international trip. That being said, remember, the officers having to use their judgment about whether this individual is going to leave the United States when their travel is over. And one of the ways that officers can do that is to ask if the applicant has ever traveled out of their country before. And if they have, where did they go? And did they come back like they were supposed to? Because if they did that, then chances are they're going to do the same when they go to the United States. So a lack of international travel can sometimes be a red flag for officers. Another thing that I found fairly often were people who were really vague or fuzzy on the details about the financial costs associated with traveling to the United States. Now, officers are often thinking when it comes to finances a couple of different ways. First, similar to what is somebody's plans when they get to the United States is, Does the applicant know the costs associated? Not necessarily down to the exact dollar or penny, but in general, what it's going to cost for them to travel and visit and stay and move around within the United States. So, do they know those costs? And then, do they have a way to pay for those costs? This is where officers will often ask about an applicant's job, their income, if they live with anybody who's contributing and helping to pay for their travel. If you're traveling for business, then often your company will pay for it. But if it's personal travel, that's typically the individual. And we do know that what might be a very good salary in an applicant's home country may be far lower than what we would expect somebody to have on hand or as a salary to pay for the costs associated. Most importantly, officers would expect that anybody who is planning a trip to the United States is going to be able to speak with some detail about the costs associated and how they're going to pay for it. And one thing I want to say here about sponsors, if somebody is offering to pay for an applicant's travel, that's fine, but the applicant should be able to explain why. Another reason why B1, B2 visas can be refused is a lack of ties. Individuals who don't have a really good reason to leave the United States at the end of their travel. And these can vary from country to country based on what's culturally appropriate, right? But officers will often ask about marital status, work history, your family situation, education, those sorts of things. In other words, they want to know, is this person, do they have a reason when they finish their travel to go back home? A compelling reason, something that's going to draw the person back. If they don't, then they may not be able to overcome the assumption that's in US visa law that every traveler to the United States plans to stay until they can convince the officer otherwise. So a lack of really strong ties can also lead to refusals. All of these things can add up to the last item that is often a reason for refusals, which is probably the most unfair. A lack of confidence, not knowing exactly what you plan to do or being able to speak clearly to the officer, being hard to understand, could be just being nervous, or it could signal that someone's not being completely honest about their plans. All of these can contribute to concerns over the true purpose of travel. And consular officers have been trained that if they're in doubt, they should refuse the visa because they know that applicants can try again at a later time. The bottom line is the most successful B1, B2 interviews are those where applicants can speak clearly, directly, and knowledgeably about their travel plans and their lives in their country of residence. So I hope these have been helpful to you as you plan perhaps for your own B1, B2 interview. Thank you.